Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to Barely Managing, quoting with confidence. To kick off this evening, we respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which we're meeting today. Today, our speakers are presenting from the lands of the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who are here today. Well, I'm going to toss it to Audrey to give a bit of an intro to what we're going to be covering today.
Thanks, Libby. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see that you're all coming and joining us today. I can see that we've got some familiar faces joining us. So hello to our community. Hi, everyone. So thanks for joining us on this webinar. It's a pretty important topic, money. I feel like all of us are probably like, how could I get paid more? How could our studio earn more money? How can I, avoid chasing invoices and just get a smoother process? We all want to know, even us, we all want to know. We're doing this for us and for you as well. So a bit about Barely Managing. Some of you might have joined us on other webinars before. If it was normal times, we would be having events in person on a variety of project management related topics. We run our Slack channel, and we'll pop the details in the chat. So if you want to join our Slack channel, you're very welcome to. We send a monthly newsletter with articles and tips. We've been a bit quiet lately. I feel like we're all a bit management fatigued and screen fatigued, but we're still there. So a bit about us. I'm Audrey. I'm design manager at Swearwords. So we focus on branding and packaging. We've got Andrea, who is studio manager at the Hungry Workshop, and they do lovely, lovely things. And Libby is a senior producer at Portable. So Libby is our digital guru in the group. So today's session will last for about, we're planning on an hour, but we always end up talking more. So, if you leave after an hour, that's fine. We understand. Everyone's hungry. But if you feel like sticking around for a bit longer, you're very welcome to. This session is all about, getting some useful tips, and it's about an exchange. Ideally, we would have done this session in person so we can have a bit of a round table and just help each other out on money-related topics. But we're doing this webinar, so feel free to ask questions in the questions section of Streamtime. So we've got the chat, questions, polls. Ask any questions you might have throughout, and then we'll try to cover those questions as we go through this session. But if we don't answer your question, feel free to email us or write it down in the Slack channel. Slack is great because other members of our group can answer as well. Before we start, I also want to do a shout out to Streamtime for sponsoring us. We couldn't be doing this without Streamtime. And before we start, I also want to ask you to tell us what you find the hardest about quoting. So we've got a poll here, the third tab. It's so time consuming. One person now. It's hard to talk to clients about money. I labor over whether the price is right. I always labor over the price is right, and I get really frustrated. Just send it out. I'm worried about how we'll compare to competitors. Quoting, can't see the last bit. Scope creep is so hard to mitigate, and all of the above. So price is right, isn't it? Like a lot of us are, struggling with that. So that's really great to see. Yeah, it is hard. That's why we're doing this. I think I'll hand it over to Andrea here. I feel like we've covered the introduction.
Yes, hello everybody. Nice to see you all. So just a little bit about what we're going to be doing this evening. We're going to be talking about the phases of a project from a financial point of view. So we're going to be starting with this kind of pre-quoting or engagement phase when a client initially reaches out. Then we're going to go and talk about the actual quoting process itself. Then touch on briefly about what happens during a project, and then finish off by talking about invoicing. And the way that we've kind of decided to structure this evening is that we've come up with this fake brief that we'll kind of be referring to throughout the evening. So we've decided that the client is a skincare brand. They are an existing business, but they've grown and changed quite a bit in the last number of years. And they've engaged the Barely Managing agency to quote the following pieces of work before they decide they want to go ahead with us. So they want to talk about branding, they have some print needs, and they need a new e-commerce website. So what we're going to be doing is Audrey will be talking about how to quote designing a new brand and style guide using techniques such as value-based pricing. I'll touch a little bit about production and printing and kind of transparency around that. And Libby will talk a bit give you some tips on quoting digital with fixed price versus agile methodology. So that's kind of the scope of the evening. And Libby's, we've put some assumptions in place for that that Libby's going to cover now.
So yeah, I guess kind of our little Barely Managing agency we have a few assumptions. Obviously anything to do with finance in a design studio is quite expansive, and we really want to focus on the actual quoting of the project today. So we're kind of making a few assumptions that you in your own studio and in our studio, we've kind of got an hourly rate. We've worked out what our hourly rate is. We've got a defined markup for any of our supplier costs, and that both of those things meet the needs of the businesses that we're running. So if you're unsure about those kind of foundational points in terms of finance, we have some further reading that we can pop in the chat to suggest, one of which is Design Business Council's book, The Business of Design, which talks all about how to run your studio from start to finish, and talks a lot about the kind of foundational parts of pricing your studio. They also have another publication around finance as well, so check out their site. And also Brutally Honest by Emily Cohen also covers off a lot of these different bits and pieces. So we're assuming that you as your studio is up and running, you've got your terms and conditions, you've got your contracts in place, and you have pretty clear kind of parameters around IP and all of those different bits and pieces. So we might as well jump into what happens at our pre-quoting phase. What is the Barely Managing agency doing?
Yes, let's do it. So pre-quoting. So some managers here with us today might have a constant stream of new clients, a lot of new business. You know, it's the case at Swearwoods. We get a lot of new business, which is a good thing. So let us know in the chat if it's your case. You know, do you get a lot of new business coming through? That'll be insightful for us to know. Others in the group, you might have more like long-term professional relationships with a handful of clients. That reminds me, when I was in advertising, I was working on only one client. So it's a lot of quoting, but it's a different kind of quoting. You know, you've already got this relationship established, a bit of trust. So I'd be curious to see if we've got some managers in this group, you know, having just a handful of clients. So of course, you don't necessarily approach quoting the same way with a prospective client and a regular client, but there's one common tip that we've identified throughout a lot of different resources and by talking to a lot of people, is that it's not being afraid of talking about money upfront. So I think it's one of those things that it's happened to all of us where you labor over a quote, you put a lot of effort, it's a big project, you know, especially in the web, you might put a lot of effort into a quote. You go super granular and you realize that clients like, I only had, you know, $2,000, and it's a real waste of your time, and also, you know, to that prospective client, or even, you know, your regular client. So really, it's about talking about money upfront. It can be challenging, but there's ways, you know, and we can get better. So essentially, you want to get an idea of the budget before you spend a lot of time preparing a proposal or an estimate. We were discussing between the three of us if it was better to have money conversations on the phone or by email or in person. And in the end, we feel it's just about finding the situation that makes you feel the most comfortable talking about it. So I know personally sometimes on the phone, especially if it's a kind of client that might be a little bit not pushy, but I kind of tend to quickly go into like, oh, but we can give you a better price sort of language. And so I find that in this case, I feel a bit more comfortable perhaps sending a rate card, just putting out there our fees. So I think it just, you go with what you're comfortable. In my role, I deal with a lot of new business requests, and generally I'll share a rate sheet by email for those inquiries where I have strong suspicions that will be a bit misaligned with our budget. You can kind of easily see those requests. Might be a young startup, and that it's just not going to fit. It's a bit of a filter and a way to make sure that both parties don't waste their time. That being said, it has happened that sending the rate sheet, the client is really interested in proceeding to a more extensive conversation. So you just got to weigh the pros and cons, and it's one of those things that sending a rate sheet, you're putting out your fees out there. So if it is a really large job, then you might not be able to do value-based pricing in that case. So we'll talk a bit more about value-based pricing further into this chat. So with our prospective skincare client, I've got a good feeling, they're established. So in this case, I'd probably set up a video conference meeting, and I'll try to find as much information as I can to put together a simple estimate or a more complex proposal with a return brief and the case studies if the project is quite large. And especially, large complex proposals, they're useful if the scope is not all locked in. So you might just put some rough numbers rather than going into more of a detailed estimate. So let's see if we've got anyone. No, we're good. All right, let's keep going.
I love the idea of the reverse brief that you were talking about, Audrey. I think for myself as well, like that reverse brief is a really important thing to, I guess, understanding what the client may be willing to pay, how you kind of at that reverse brief stage get a bit of a sense of what is the value that they're trying to deliver. You start to get pull through more of the wider context, rather than it just being, hey, I'm going to quote these line items for you and give you very neat prices for each of these things. It's really helpful to have that context to where does this project sit within the kind of the realm of what the business is trying to achieve, right? Karsh has got a question. What are some classic questions you would ask in a reverse brief? I've got a few go-tos. My one is always just what are you trying to achieve? What are your peripheral considerations? What else is happening? If I've done a bit of research about the client before I get on the phone with them for my first conversation, I might have done a bit of research around what industry they're in, maybe some stuff that's in the news about that industry, just to get a bit of a sense of how they're kind of placed. And then I'll always ask, what does success look like for you? What?
That's a good question.
Definitely a really good one. I'm always looking, I think, on both, depending on how big the organization is that you're working with. If it's quite a little organization like a skincare brand, I feel like you might be having some direct interfacing with the people who own the organization. But definitely even understanding the motivations for whatever project manager you might be working with at a larger organization is just as important in my mind. So that success piece is the big thing. Goal, considerations, what does success look like? What do you guys think?
I think that's so true. For me, from a production point of view, I think a lot of times clients have this idea in their head of what they want, and unit cost is really important to them, but they don't necessarily think about that until it's so natural to them. But you need to kind of draw that out from them sometimes, because it's easier to work backwards from that than a budget. So that's a really big one that I ask from a production point of view. What about you, Audrey?
Yeah, same. I think we'll talk a bit about sort of the with relation to value-based pricing, the kind of questions that you can ask to be able to put forward an estimate that isn't reliant on time. So I'll walk you through those questions in a minute. But I think we're ready to talk about quoting. Let's get in the thick of it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Perfect.
Do you want to kick us off with this value-based pricing?
Yes. So value-based pricing. Do we have many people here with us today pricing based on value rather than time? If that's your case, if you do a lot of value-based pricing, I'd love to hear from you and even get your input in the chat if you do. I have to say, I only became aware of value-based pricing maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Before that, it would have even crossed my mind to quote using something else than time. And at the beginning, I felt quite uncomfortable at the idea of quoting based on an abstract measure of value. And we've got Jen saying, she hasn't heard of it. So yeah, this is great because hopefully that might be of benefit for your work. So value-based pricing is a pretty interesting approach for a branding project like we have in our brief with this skincare client. An identity or a logo is a super valuable piece for a business because in many ways it's what defines it. It's the face, it's its face to the world. It lasts a long time. So, can you just use time as a metric to define how much the identity is worth? Well, it's one way of, helping you build your quote, but it's not just the only way. A lot of us will have heard of the classic Nike swoosh logo example where a student designed it for reportedly $35 US, which, anyway, we won't dwell on that. It's not got a value of $26 billion. So, yeah, I think it was Caroline, her name was, just... she should have used value-based pricing. That would mean a lot of work of a lot of hours, in the work if we were converting that in time. So another example is the famous American graphic designer Paula Scher said about the Citigroup logo she designed, and that's in the Netflix Abstract series. She says, "It took me a few seconds to draw it, but it took me 34 years to learn to draw it in a few seconds." So in terms of reason for, why we do value-based pricing, and it's okay to quote, based on value rather than time, is that all the experience that a business, that a designer gets over time, that has a price, and you're not going to put it as a line item, graduated and in that year, and this is everything that I've done. But this is why you're able to do value-based pricing. So in his book, Hourly Billing is Nuts, Jonathan Stark says, "Billing by the hour is just as bizarre as billing by the pixel or by the line. They are all arbitrary units of measure that have nothing whatsoever to do with the outcome of the work." It's hard to disagree with Jonathan here. So why is billing by the hour so common? I actually don't really have the answer to that. I don't know if maybe, maybe you have some ideas. Could also be, lawyers quote by the hours, doctors. So maybe it's just a remnant of some kind of industries that, one person's health is not more valuable than others. Or maybe it is actually in this day and age. It seems like it is. But I think it's sort of carried across the design, but it doesn't have to be. Like Stars says in his book, the big problem with hourly billing is that it misaligns the direct financial incentives between a studio or a designer and the client. So in other words, the longer the project takes, the better it is for you and the worse it is for the client. And it works both ways because the less time you spend as you become more efficient, the less you'll be able to charge. So at a certain point, you'll reach the maximum number of hours in a day that you can bill for. Hourly billing essentially places an artificial limit on your income as a designer or a studio. So let's see some comments here. Streamtime. Quoting by the hour is fine as long as you then bill by the hour. Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. Here are all the extra hours we spent on that project. Yeah, it's a disadvantage to be more efficient with hourly rate. Exactly. So, as a business, like you actually cannot grow if you only bill by the hour because you're only human. We only have, 24 hours in a day. So it becomes quite challenging. And the thing is, a client doesn't buy hours, they buy results. your expertise, what you can do for them that will improve their business. So for this reason, it's important when quoting to state outcomes, not just deliverables. So this is something that as managers, we've heard a lot, it's not just about stating, design this and prepare finished art or supply, HTML files. It's how are you going to actually contribute to your client's business? And this is what, Libby was saying about earlier. It's thinking about successes, goals, their vision. Writing for me doesn't necessarily come naturally. So sometimes I struggle with writing really sort of convincing statements of outcomes. But, you can create some templates and you can rely on other things as well to sort of help in showing the value that you're going to bring to your client. But yes, those questions are really important to get from your clients. So there's no hard rule for value-based pricing. It's a bit of a dark art. How do you define the value of a project? Jonathan Stark says, value is the maximum amount that a consumer would be willing to pay for an item. So it gets a bit easier to do value-based pricing as you get more experience. You'll have tested out, what worked, what didn't, and especially when you have a background knowledge of, the space that your client is in. So we've got Jen saying, how do you then manage the conversations of value-based estimate versus hourly-based invoices? It's a bit more of an ongoing conversation. Yeah, so I think I highly actually recommend that you read Jonathan Stark's book. He actually doesn't, in his book, he says there's basically no scope creep. Like he never charges for time, beyond scope. And I'm actually a bit surprised that I would find that quite challenging for me when I do value-based pricing. I still have rounds of refinements involved. And I do it based on, I still use time as a baseline for how I quote it. And my invoice is going to be made based on the value that I've, put out. So for instance, if if my value is say $1,000, well, it's irrelevant. I guess I've prepared it based on, using hours as a reference, but it's irrelevant. My invoice is irrelevant of the amount of time that I spend. So in some cases, I'll probably go, under time. So say, I've had estimated that it would take me 10 hours and we ended up spending 8 hours. So that's even better because I did value-based pricing and we did the job under the expected time. But in other times you do value-based pricing. And I guess it's just a normal sort of estimate, right? Like you'll have estimated amount of time, but you then go over. And in this case, it's just, a bit of a learning curve. That's where I still consider scope creep with value-based pricing. I put a really detailed brief, and if the project goes, beyond the deliverables, then that still requires a new quote. That being said, when it gets to more of the sort of technical side of a project, if it's that in the end there's an additional format to that's required, it needed an A4 poster as well as an A3 for example. I don't do value-based pricing for these items because there's not really much value at this point. The value is in the logo, it's in the concept, in the strategy. So at this point, it gets more into just time. Hope that answers your question.
Andre, you guys do a lot of I guess as working in print, you're often describing what the value of per line item of what you guys are doing. How do you guys tend to tackle I guess the value rather than would you quote the quantities on your invoices for certain things for print, or would you tend to just have it within, if we were tackling this type of brief and the clients come to you and said, hey, we want to get some print work done, would you in that particular instance kind of give that skincare brand how would you break down your quote for them?
Well, with we definitely do time. It's a bit trickier. Well, it's easier actually with print because it takes a certain amount of time. Over 10 years, you might have figured out how, kind of averaged out how much the actual printing time takes. So we do that. But we've also, I think transparency is really important in terms of what else you're doing in it. So I would break down everything in a line item to show the individual pieces for each bit that goes into the project. I think a big part of when you're quoting, a really big important part of it is to kind of educate the client. A lot of times the client will come to you, and whether it's print or digital or branding or whatever it is, they know what they're doing really well, but they don't necessarily know what you're doing. So they have a bottom line, or they have a unit cost in mind, or whatever that is. But it's your job to kind of educate them on what you do, and they've come to you for your expertise. So you should, value your work at what it costs, and then, teach them that that's the way it is. So from a print point of view, it's becoming production is becoming increasingly less common. So it's like an increasingly mystified kind of thing. So there's a really big disconnect between what clients think they want, what the designer's vision, and then actually what it costs to get things done. So like I said, part of the role is to educate the client on the options. So with the skincare brand, they want to print business cards, but once we've had kind of that initial chat with them and learned a bit more of them, not necessarily a return brief, because it's much more concrete at this stage when you're getting to the production, but found out a bit more about what they're doing. So maybe they also need product cards to go in the boxes, or something else, that they might be writing handwritten notes to the clients on a branded piece of stationery. So we might suggest something else that adds value to their offering. And then I would start off by quoting exactly what they've asked for. So at this stage, I've probably worked with a designer. They've got a beautiful brand that Audrey's sorted out for them. So I'll quote exactly what they're asking for, even if I might have a vibe that it's outside of their budget. And then what I'll do is provide at least one more option that's more cost effective, but still kind of bearing their vision in mind. And this is kind of where that line item really comes in. So you quote the paper that you're using, how many, depending on the process, say it's letterpress, like what we do at Hungry Workshop, the printing plates that you need. And then that kind of gives them an idea of what's costing the most or what's costing the least, and gives you a bit of a wiggle room and kind of levers to pull to adjust things. So maybe they really want foil on their business cards, but they can't afford to do 10,000 cards. So we kind of reduce the quantity, which reduces the time. Or maybe the stock they wanted was really beautiful, but it's a bit more on the premium end. So we'll say, oh, you can see on this line item that the cost, the majority of the cost is actually the paper. So if we switch that, then we have a bit more wiggle room in other directions. So transparency in production is really important. I think a lot of people think of production as this nebulous thing. So just to see a number spat out at you that's like, oh, you want 10,000 of these, that's going to cost you 7,321. That's it doesn't mean anything. And if I was buying that, I'd be a little bit, I'd want to know more. So I think that the transparency is key when you get to that stage. Another element of that is kind of sending samples to back up what you're doing. That's really important. I would definitely give some samples to the skincare brand, especially if they're looking to kind of invest a lot of money in what they're doing. The last thing I wanted to talk about when you're talking about quoting production is markups. I know a lot of people can get funny about markups, but they are kind of essential for covering your time. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, measuring paper, cutting it down, figuring the artwork, that kind of thing. So putting markups, and this isn't actually just for print projects. Libby, I'm sure in the digital space there's that, and when you're quoting on branding, you might be working with outside suppliers. So the markup is all about kind of absorbing and managing risk. If something goes wrong and you've outsourced some of the work, then you kind of need to be the one to cover it. And a markup is there as kind of a cushion. And it is industry practice, so I think it's definitely something not to be scared of. I see a question here from Steve. Do I find that giving them the cheaper option ends up being a motivation for them to spend less with you? Not really. I mean, I think for me, I see it as I've heard what what your needs are, and here's a way for us to still get what you want done. Because we always give a second option that might be cheaper, but is still kind of trying to maintain the vision of what they're after. And it kind of builds a relationship. I think what Audrey was saying earlier about repeat or new customers, I think especially for that initial engagement, if you kind of really help them out and still giving them a quality product, then they'll come back to you in the future. And I think it pays off in repeat business.
Yeah, it really does. Sometimes I find that, if you're just being honest that, you're not necessarily trying to just get more money out of them, you're just trying to really help their business. And I feel like over time, it shows perhaps that first conversation, people might be a bit suspicious of each party's intentions, but over time, as you say, it's I think it really values that relationship. And Andrea, it's really good that you do those options, because in value-based pricing, it's also one of the tips of not just giving out one quote or one estimate. And Steve had a good point about, an estimate is exactly that, an estimate, but clients often see this as a fixed price that you're locked in. So we actually are careful not to say quote on our documents. We say estimate, and we've got some TBCs here and there. When it's really ballpark, we'll be sure to write it down. But I mean, sometimes you can't write it down enough. I think, it's about that explanation, but that's a really good point. And Penny was saying, I find that giving 3 option pushes most decisions into the middle option, because it's not the most expensive, but not the cheapest. And yeah, that's a psychological trick, if you will, that, people don't tend to go into the middle. So 3 options are actually quite good for that. It can be a bit tedious to prepare, a lot of estimates, but yeah, it's a valuable thing to do. If you don't mind, I'm just going to circle back a bit onto some of the value-based pricing comments. Actually, one of the ways that I, for our project of our skincare brand, a trick as well is to actually look at, it can be a bit challenging, but to look at, at what price point is your brand selling their product at, and how are you expecting, what's the expectations of their sales. So, if it's a large business that sells quite wide and have a high price point, where you might think, okay, well, they actually, I can get an idea of the sort of money that they have available to spend on a project. You might even find some, that gets pretty, it's a bit of research, but you could have a look online, if that business has been sold. Sometimes you'll see, if it's a publicly listed business, you'll see at what price it's been sold. So, for you as a designer, it's like, well, okay, if they're really established, maybe they have more budget to spend. We were talking about the initial engagement earlier. You'll get clues on how to price your project during that initial engagement with your prospective clients. It's all about asking the right questions to understand how you or your business can contribute positively to the client. It's all about those successes we were talking about. A few questions that you might ask in your initial engagement are, why choosing us? If your client tells you, well, you're the best agency or the best designer that I could possibly find, then that in your reverse brief, well, these are like, well, if you don't go with us, you won't really get what you're really after. Not put into those words, but another question might be
too much honesty.
Yeah, you'll be so sorry. What would a home run look like for you? Talking about success, what would be a successful outcome for this project? Why doing the project now? So they might say, if I don't do it now, I'll lose a lot of possible sales. So for you, it's like, well, there's an importance in doing that project now. If it's an existing business, you could ask, how has your business performed over the last 12 months? I've tried this question. I don't really get many answers. I think, people are not necessarily open to give you their whole financial health, journey. But you can try to ask questions in that similar vein. But the question, what is the top 3 things you'd want to change in your business to make it more successful? I tend to get quite a bit of answers there, and then you can see if you as a designer or a business can actually answer any of those top 3 things. So yeah, by asking those questions, hopefully you'll get a few clues to help you decide on the appropriate price for your estimate. And for value-based pricing, essentially you have to convince your client that you have the experience to bring them success, even if you're more expensive than others. So that's really the big thing, is that you might come out more expensive, but if you've got the background and the foundation to back up your estimate and your work, then you'll most likely succeed. So it's helpful to have case studies you can share with them that explicitly prove the success you can bring. I mean, Hungry Workshop, you've got so much beautiful products and samples. So this is one of those ways that, you send it out, you can see the amazing print result that they're going to get. It's really helpful, and, I'm sure it justifies sometimes that you are a bit more of a premium printer than another. So yeah, it really gives reassurance to the client that if you've done the work for others, you can do it for them. We're going to pop into the chat a useful case study example. So this comes from the Design Effectiveness Awards in the UK. It's an award of design effectiveness. It's quite complex. You have to put together quite a complex proposal to get into the awards, but their Seed and Bean case study is actually a really good resource to try to build a case study for your business. And I guess a variation of value-based pricing, which I find actually works quite well when we're really busy trying to churn out estimates, is to price different rates for different type of tasks. So we spoke about, maybe like concept is something that has a lot more value than finished art. So you could do I suppose one way of doing value-based pricing is you ask and you charge more for concept than you would charge for those smaller tasks.
There's a great question from Laura in the channel. She was asking, how does a rate card work when you're working to value-based pricing? And I know that you mentioned earlier, like, you might actually start with your rate card and working out like doing some hourly calculations as a start. Do you want to talk a little bit about, and you're talking now, I guess, about some of those, how you might actually charge different things at different rates?
Yeah. So the rate card I tend to use only when I know that, when I get a real sense that this project is going to be a minimal budget. So I don't value-based price all the projects. Just in the line of work, we work with a lot of small to medium businesses. So there's just a point to which they wouldn't be viable. I would do more value-based pricing when you're doing more corporate. If you're actually liaising with a marketing director, usually it sort of, gives an indication that there's a potential for value-based pricing. If it was, like the business owner, oftentimes the point at which we are in our business, it actually wouldn't work out. So rate card, I only use, so essentially I have a combination of pricing techniques. I've got my hourly rate, which then is based on, gets carried into my rate card, and then I've got value-based pricing. And essentially I feel like this is a nice way where your business can grow, because you're not only reliant on your time and your energy to, for finances, but that value-based pricing helps sort of like pad and give you more chances for growth. Hope that answers the question. Did we have other questions? Maybe you were saying
especially around like fixed price versus kind of like traditional kind of like design sprint type quoting. I think I might
in a bit, yeah.
That in a little bit. Yeah.
And some of, it's one of those things that in previous Barely Managing webinars we've spoken about, do you include a design or like a project management or a design management line item in your estimates? I used to include one all the time, and I was really stubborn that, our time is valuable, projects would not be completed if if we weren't there. And I realized that it kept being a point of negotiation, disbursements and project management, where I accept a quote if these things are out. And it's like, it's really hard to actually have those discussions. So rather than, you know, negotiating on something that it just didn't really create a nice beginning of relationships with our client, I end up, you know, I consider it into my job plan, but it gets absorbed into the overall estimate. So the client doesn't really see that in talking about outcomes rather than deliverables, my time actually, you know, they don't really need to see that I'm there. It's
exactly it. Like what is the value of what you're delivering and what needs to happen for that, for you to deliver those outcomes. It includes things like design management. Like it's usually important to actually delivering a really cohesive project on time and on budget.
And I find that it's never been an issue in advertising where I was dealing with other managers, other marketing professionals. It was just a known fact that, you know, project management is required. But when you talk perhaps with the business owner, or then it's just something that they don't necessarily have the knowledge of the necessity of having that in a project.
I think language is important as well. Like I remember Carol gave us this tip once, calling it design management instead of project management. Design management, and it's the same thing, spoiler alert. But for someone who's kind of not versed in the vernacular of design, design management maybe sounds a bit more, I don't know, a bit more serious than just a project management, because there's so many, I'm sure we all have clients that think that they can do it all themselves, and project management makes it sound like anybody could do it. So I think calling it design management, if you're going to leave it in, doing that is another trick. Trick is the wrong word, but tip.
And I guess finally on value-based pricing, there's a Win Without Pitching by Blair Enns is a really good resource if you want to know more about it. They approach a lot of the sort of good, better, best approaches, you know, to gain bargaining leverage. So it's worth having a look at that if you're interested. And I think just to wrap things up on value-based pricing, for me, it really doesn't come naturally. And if it does come naturally to some of you, like, go for it. This is an awesome skill to have. You know, quoting by time for me is deeply rooted in my manager's psyche. So the takeaway is, you know, don't necessarily just consider time as a metric for building an estimate. If you feel like there's an opportunity for something else, and to really think about the, you know, how much your work is worth. And just to take it easy, and, you know, it'll take experience. You just try it once, and you see how it goes. It's a bit like, it's just a trial and error.
If the only way, like, to earn more money is to work more hours, like, that just, it doesn't seem possible.
It doesn't actually, like, that to me is the most sort of convincing aspect of it. You actually, there's a misalignment completely. And for that reason, in some cases, you've got to quote differently. Yeah, work smarter, not harder. Totally.
We have to break out. I think there's the tension exists between value-based pricing, but also as a studio, as a manager, you're the one there's only so many hours in the day, and every week you have to distribute time between your designers, your developers, or whoever's working. So I think, Audrey, you were asking earlier, you know, this kind of why we get stuck into hourly based pricing. And I think the tension is between, well, I've actually got 5 staff and there's 40 hours this week and we need to work on XYZ things. So I think that's where that tension comes from. But over time, you kind of know the speed at which your staff work, and
exactly.
Settle into your rhythms.
Steve actually asked, do you factor in the time to put together the estimate into the price? That's a really good one, and it's something that many, you know, software platforms like Streamtime really encourage you to create a line item to track your time, and yet charge that. For me, because there's some estimates that are so recurrent, you know, like some of my brand identity projects, we've done hundreds and hundreds of them, so they're really easy to roll out. I don't really consider my time, but if it was, and I'm sure, Libby, you'd have a lot of insights on that for like web estimates. Like you really do need to I think, to put your time, to consider your time. For us with packaging as well, like putting packaging estimates together, there's so much to consider. We've tried actually even doing sort of similar to, you know, how, I don't know, like a landscape designer might require not a down payment, but, you know, a payment for them to come to your site in a quote. So we've tried to do that a little bit, saying, you know, here are our case studies, and you know, this is what you know that we're going to deliver good work for you, but we do have, I don't know, a fee of $500 to go through this kind of briefing and estimating, and this sort of makes you make sure that your clients are really serious about it. From experience, it hasn't been the most successful. I think clients tend to say, oh, if I need to get to pay money before even getting work, it's a hard sell, but I would strongly actually recommend trying it out.
Some ways that like you could approach it is like, there's like two things, right? Like factoring in the time that like you need to do to put together like the estimate, kind of folds into, I think, like how your whole business is structured and what your rate is, like how much you as a business need to bill like per month to make sure that the lights are on and all the other administrative things.
Yes,
take away. Some businesses decide, from my experience, to build that into the quote, and others might have it purely as an unbillable sales thing because they're doing things like value-based estimating to make sure that they're billing enough per quarter and they know exactly how much their rate is. So I think it's really dependent on what type of business that you're running, and basically looking at your overall financials is what I've seen businesses do to understand whether or not you bill that as something like under your line items in your quote. I guess the other thing is like if you've got a really complicated, and like as Audrey said, like sometimes in digital you can have a really complex type of project that you need to quote, and that sometimes it's a bit of a hard sell to go, actually, well, we need time to like actually understand what this problem is, it even is, what we're trying to solve. In this scenario, say part of the brief for this skincare brand was not to actually design a website from scratch. It was to actually take over an existing website and basically redesign it, rebuild it, but use the old code base, whatever that might be. Well, you could actually say, hey, actually, to give you like an actual price on what we think is going to be required, we actually need to go and have a look at all this historical code. We need to go and have a look at that. So we might do something like a technical audit. And, you know, you might go, hey, actually, look, if we do a technical audit, what you'll receive as an outcome that'll be really valuable to you is a really clear audit on the state of your code, all of the information that you might need for even if you didn't decide to go with us, you have all of the technical background information, auditing your site and what it's currently set up as, what patches need to be made, what improvements would need to be done. And as part of that process, we will give you a finalized estimate at the end of that talks about the scope of work that we think you would need to invest in order to deliver the outcomes that you're doing. So by kind of going through that scoping process, you're actually kind of giving the client like a really tangible takeaway that they can go, yep, cool. It means then that like you might in fact charge a time and materials approach for that. It's just like, hey, look, we actually just need like, 20 hours to actually go in and look at the code, unpack it. As part of that, we'll actually document all our findings. And that's something that you might not actually do as a value-based thing. You might actually go time and materials because it's really just about the time and effort that it takes to go and actually understand what actually needs to be done, right? So that's definitely an approach that you can take with building back in the estimating time as well. What do you guys think? Have you done stuff like that before? Have you had other things fly like that? It's a very technical kind of digital focus in that scenario. But I have seen things be done like that before.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, with all things is that, even with value-based pricing is you need to start with your time, so it's because you need to get an idea of how long things are going to take. So time is not, a metric that you completely ditch. So yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a side comment, but
I think in my experience, it's kind of what you're talking about, Libby. It really depends on who's doing the quoting. You know, if a senior designer is working on the quote, then I'd probably try to work that in. I mean, I don't know why they would be, but if they were, for example, I'd probably try and work that in somehow. Whereas depending on the structure of your studio, there is a project manager whose time gets covered in all the jobs that you do. So you don't need to kind of account for it further. And that kind of ties back to what Audrey was saying about different rates for different people working on things, or different positions.
Totally. Yep. So it's a balancing act. Like it's a juggle, it's a dance. Like the whole process of quoting, I feel, is like this little dance that you're kind of doing with your client to try and get the right information out of them so that you can try and really nail the price.
And it's actually quite funny to sort of go back, you go through time and you see how your quotes and your estimates have changed in a format so much over the time, and you're like, Jesus, I can never make my mind up, those things. But I think it's just about seeing what works, and if it doesn't work, you just try something else. And it's that language we were talking about.
Definitely.
And I think it's about one thing we haven't really touched on. It's about the relationship that you're building with I think all of this is kind of moot if you haven't really proven to the client that you really get what they're trying to do. And that all comes from, line items or things like that. If you have kind of established a good rapport with them, and whether that's through phone conversations or you've met in person or whatever, then that element is also really important. Even though it's a bit more nebulous. I think that they'll be more willing to go on the journey with you if they trust you, because they've
definitely.
Libby, you've got a lot to talk about to us on digital pricing.
And I think like a lot of it can be extrapolated to ways I've approached like quoting any type of design project in the past as well. But I think to your point, Andrea, like that relationship building part is really important for me when I'm quoting. And particularly in digital, like there's a lot of unknowns sometimes, especially in the scenario of if the skincare brand came to us and said, hey, we want you to redesign an existing site. Well, it's a very different story to us starting that website from scratch. So I think like step one is like have a worksheet, whatever format that is, if it's a spreadsheet, if it's in your tool that you're using, and like get to a granular level of detail of all the different things that you need to do across this particular project based on what you know already. So you might not have all the information at that point, but you can pretty much broad brush strokes get down as many of the little details as you can. I even go to the point of asking my designers and my developers to help me estimate different tasks. And I think it's really important that you can rely on your team to also help you sometimes shape that estimating. If you're working in a role which is more like studio management or design management, and you're often the one doing the quoting siloed, sometimes reaching out and getting like a bit of a sense check from your designers or your developers on what they actually think the effort to do the task is straight up is a really great way to start. I think especially in digital, I can in my mind think, oh yeah, I think the effort of kind of doing a feature is about this, and I think it's probably valued at about this. But at the end of the day, sometimes my developer can turn around and go, oh no, Libby, that's not what's involved in doing that at all. There's a whole heap of technical dependencies. And so, how easy or simple an integration is might not actually be what I actually assume it is. So I actually go through a point of, I get down everything on a big worksheet. I estimate out every tiny little line item, and actually sometimes at the end of that process, I can be really surprised by, oh, actually like everything that we need to do on this project is really quite expensive, and that final number can kind of be a bit surprising. So the way I would approach this type of skincare project is go, okay, well, I know I've got to do 3 templates, and I know I've got to make sure that we've got some milestones for approvals, that we've got 2 rounds of changes, like, okay, there's integrations, like what, how long might it take us to set up a MailChimp integration for the e-commerce aspect, like all of those little things, stepping it out as finely detailed as you can at that point in time is a really great way to get a very top line broad brushstroke of what the overall estimate could end up being.
And I imagine, Libby, it would be a nice way as well, if you did want to do this sort of good, better, best, you've got all your items, so you can say, well, I suppose this is the essential, this is the nice to have, and then that's you've really covered all the grounds.
You really have. Like, that is you're spot on, Audrey. Like, that is, you get a very high level view of all the different things the client's asking for, and you can already start to see where the best places for you to start to talk about negotiating on scope might be. And so I found that really, really helpful. I guess the next thing is, like, my second tip is, like, really around building in some, like, agile flexibility. So part of, people kind of ask a lot about, how do you price an agile digital project? Well, within an agency, it's very difficult because agile projects, to their proper agile software development really is about having the luxury of, you've often got like endless funding and long timelines for this type of stuff, and it's just time and materials for, what you get done within 100 hours is what you get done, basically. Whereas it's very different working in an agency, that you have a client who has a very set budget, who has very set deliverables that they need to meet. And so often I think with digital projects is, like I said, there's a lot of unknowns that can sometimes, especially with inherited projects, can kind of be floated throughout the process, and you might not know that up front. And so at the very beginning of a project, when I'm kind of talking about a scope of works with the client, the way that I feel that you can get the best of both worlds, that you can quote fixed price, but is just talk to the client early about some collaborative prioritization. So really upfront about, what assumptions we're making, and that if something happens in the project where it's like, oh, actually we made an assumption at this point when we quoted that the integration would be dependent on a third party. That's fine. We knew that. Turns out that third party isn't actually supporting us in the integration that we want to use anymore, and having those conversations with the client throughout the process. So basically expressing to the client that what we deliver is a shared responsibility, and that any unknowns that we have and we tackle throughout the project, we'll actually come to them and say, hey, there's a change in what we're facing. What would you like us to do? We can, and having some solutions at hand where it's like, we can choose to look, definitely going to need extra budget on a new feature like this. Or, hey, what's actually your priority for this launch date? What are the most important things? So basically, even within a fixed cost and a fixed price, I think it's still possible to be agile in the way that you are working with your client to deliver a digital project. But what it takes is some conversations at the very, very beginning and in my statements of work, where it says, look, we're making a lot of these assumptions, but if we come across a hurdle, or the requirements change, or something about this development project, we hit a roadblock, is that we will come to you with what those things are, and you will help us decide what you would like, basically. So I think what that means is that, if you've got something wildly, if there's a lot of assumptions you're making about a digital project, then you're already having those conversations up front. So
that's why strategy is quite, and however we want to call it, like these initial phases where you're just doing strategy or discovery, you're finding out about things. This is kind of where it's nice, where you can say, look, we'll spend some time to look at things, but things might change. And to go back on language, I think that's where actually for me, it's always a balancing act between being sort of quite didactical about, estimate based on, this supplied by client, or, it can be quite sterile and cold, the language, but at the same time, you want it to be clear. But on the other hand, you also want to sort of make it sound like, it's just part of a process of discovery. So it's interesting to sort of weave into your estimates these kind of contingencies for the unknowns. I know that in design and packaging, like we don't necessarily know whether we're going to need a copywriter, or we don't necessarily know whether we're going to need an illustrator, or that we're going to need a motion designer. But design isn't a linear process, so I think it's important to just have it somewhere in there, in your estimate, that there's a potential for ideas that might require additional time or additional, funds. And also talk about it in person as well. I think it's because I actually find when you're on the receiving end of seeing a quote, like there's a lot of information in there. And I feel like if I was a client, I probably would not read everything in detail. So taking someone through the document in person is probably a really good thing.
Definitely.
And that's where that relationship comes in as well. If you built a good rapport with them, if you get to the stage where, in a digital scenario, it's like, oh, this actually doesn't work. It's going to be another 10 grand or whatever it is. If you've built that good relationship, ideally, they don't think that you're just trying to screw them over. That's important as well.
Definitely. Adrian has a really good question about if you're working in an internal studio and about how to manage rounds of changes and revisions with clients and how to prevent that happening. That's a really hard scenario, like really, really hard. I haven't personally had that experience before. Have Audrey or Andrea, have either of you got any advice in that space?
I'm just reading the question.
I haven't, no, but my partner has, and it is really tough, even from a distance, so I can imagine. I think based on what I know from his experience is, and this isn't necessarily easy to do, but it all kind of comes down to the leadership. If you're in a bigger company and it is kind of an internal agency, as the project manager, you might be, 10 people down the ladder. And so you kind of writing a really tight brief and all that may not, necessarily get heard by the right people. So I wonder if there's a way to kind of get the leadership involved and set the tone for how that all works. I know that's easy to say and harder to do.
But leadership to me is also, that made me think this question that it sort of almost comes down to, this is what working on a retainer might be like. You've got a set amount of hours or a set amount of budget, and there might be a lot of changes. So I think it's leadership and also good overall management of doing those reviews. So it reminds me actually, when I was working in advertising, this was actually brilliant. I don't even think that I actually wasn't doing timesheets because was I doing timesheets? I can't remember. Anyway, it was never a problem to go over budget because we were just running the campaigns and no, we were doing timesheets because that would have not made any sense. But it was just reviewed at every end of year. And that was just the strategic leadership, and they were reviewing with the strategic leadership of our clients, and then we're making adjustments for what the budgets might be like for future years. But I think fundamentally what was driving our efforts was deadlines. You can go through too many rounds of refinements if you've got a deadline to hit. So I think deadline often, I'm always a bit nervous when clients say I don't have a deadline because
I don't have a budget.
Yeah, well, it's because then there's just not, it's good. I mean, I think for a designer it's good to have milestones, things to work towards. And it helps as well, there's, you don't just, work at refining over and over again. You just got to get it out. So I would say probably having a good process of these, I guess, milestones of strategy, briefing, good reviews, and then some opportunities for just reviewing time spent and readjusting any kind of negotiations in the future.
And the other thing, Adrian, is I think I know I've worked in a studio where we actually made all the designer bookings visible to everybody else in the studio. So we had it up on a big TV where everyone could come to the studio and actually see the work that was currently happening and see when people were really overbooked. So if it is an instance of where you're working in an internal studio and you're constantly really busy, I can just imagine that you really are, other people have some visibility over the workload of the design team as well. So if there are ways that you can make those things more visible, I don't know if it's like a weekly newsletter going, here's what design's working on upcoming, and like make sure you've got got all your changes in because there's going to be no time to do them later. Like maybe there's another way by making work more visible, that people are tighter in returning things so that they're not kind of going back and forth so much. But that's just a suggestion.
I think that's a really good segue to kind of talk about what happens during a project and how you manage scope creep. Because I think, just to follow on from what you're saying, these kinds of issues for me, it's always a bit of a carrot and stick approach and kind of negotiating when it's a big deal and when it isn't. And sometimes, sadly, you just have to do it, but you kind of have some, you kind of keep those situations in mind when you need a bit of ammo to negotiate with later. So there's no kind of really hard and fast rule or solution to it, I think.
Absolutely.
And it depends on who you're working with. Like, you might be like, look, I helped you last time. I literally don't have any time left in my week to do this. And here are the consequences, like Jen was saying. I think that's such a good point about how you can be a bit more honest, hopefully. The culture kind of allows for that. But to talk about scope creep, how do you guys kind of handle that? It's a bit, again, in production, there's not really much to say. It's
pretty obvious, is there been a scope, like, it's just,
oh, you want to change it? Okay, cool, we have to start over.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess for me is I really do include the rounds of refinements into the estimate, but I am flexible on this. I think it would be, if I want to preserve the relationship, I'll weigh in the pros and cons of, asking for, I guess, redoing the estimates to adjust. So, if it's a minor change and we're doing well with time, I won't really mention. That being said, if it's sort of like, I don't want to set a precedent. So if I then see that there's a lot of those tiny changes that keep happening, then I might just put my foot down and say, look, we're getting close to running out of time. And this is where it gets challenging, where I feel like when you're trying to put your foot down, saying we're running out of time is a great tool. But when you're quoting on value-based pricing, you've got to be really careful of the kind of language that you're using. So yeah, it's just, it can be a bit challenging there. But we're
set rounds of changes or something. Like if you, like the skincare brand, like if you were quoting for the skincare brand, would you include like a set amount of changes?
Yeah, probably. I mean, and I think, at least 1 or 2, but I think when you have a good structure, and that's where, this is more of a waterfall approach to management, but you just make sure that you agree together on, what is the right course of action for the next step. So I think this way you minimize rounds of refinements, and often they're pretty obvious if it's a major round of refinement or if you've already prepared, say, the final files and then there's a change, don't, in that case, it's I find that the hardest is when there hasn't really been any rounds of feedback if we actually have underquoted, and then there's the whole studio is just kind of, oh, we're really spending over time, but it's not necessarily a fault of the client. Then I think that's in terms of the studio morale, it can be a bit challenging. One of the things that when I was working in advertising on the one account, my director sometimes was moving time between projects if we were going over one but under another. So look, I haven't done it as a manager, but seeing as it, was the same, I guess, overall budget, it was just a way of managing those conversations. You just, if you know that you're doing well, then you just transfer. Libby, you mentioned something when we were talking about over delivering on scope, and I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah, it's like one of the hardest things, right? That sometimes, like, because you want your team to be doing a good job, and you want the team to put forward like the best quality design work, but actually just sometimes there is a limit, and part of the design brief is also how much we have to deliver this piece of value in this. Yeah,
you're not delivering the best option, like you've agreed on the goods, so you can't,
Exactly. Yeah. So sometimes that's hard. That's a hard kind of conversation to have with your team about making sure that they're regular check-ins to keep them on track, to make sure, and talking to them about budget. And I think that's part of the reason why I like to get my team in on shaping some of what this is at a very early stage, and getting them in on that process also means that by the time we kind of actually get to doing the work, that it means that they've already had a hand in going, oh yeah, no, you know, how much they were thinking that they wanted to kind of spend on a project like this and what would be needed to deliver it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a tricky one.
We've got Adrian saying,
Steve has a really good question about how avoiding the client
yes.
like you haven't met the requirements. I think this comes back to the reverse brief. I think it's one thing when the client's like, I don't like it, or oh, we haven't met the brief. I think those are two different things,
Yes.
which often the client might think are the same, but are not, just because they don't like the color blue. But their audience does. I mean, that's super simplified, but you know, the difference between not answering the brief and the client not liking it. And I think that just comes down to those initial conversations.
Yeah, these are the hard conversations to have.
Yeah.
But
and being prepared to walk away. I mean, to be honest, if you know, you kind of clash a few times and they feel like they feel like you're not delivering on what they're after, but you genuinely feel like you're answering the brief that you work together, I think you have to be willing to walk away, even though that's, you know.
Yeah, I think it is
comes in handy.
Yeah, it is one of those things. And I was talking to another manager about this, like, and they really believe that, you know, rounds of refinements are actually kind of a bit of a fraud, because yeah, you know, especially in those cases where you actually haven't delivered good enough work, and you really don't want to be in those situations. I don't think any studio or designer wants to realize that, you know, it's not good work, but sometimes it does happen. And in these situations, it's just about kind of being honest about, you know, do I really stand behind that work? And if you don't, then it's just if you feel like there's no chance for that relation to go anywhere, then I guess it's a situation of like, well, I can rely on my rounds of refinements as a way of, you know, cutting ties, perhaps because, as you said, Andrea, like there's a clash between your aesthetic and your way of doing things and the clients, and then I guess it's just a negotiation. But yeah, I find there's so many times with design, especially working with identities, if we feel like we've answered the brief and we're out of our rounds of refinements, then we won't really you know, offer more rounds. If we feel like we could have done a better job, or that there's just so much at stake and we really want this relationship with the client to continue, then we'll just take the brunt and we'll be honest about the situation. You know, we're, you know, massively over time, but we really want to make this right, and then we proceed. So I guess it's just about weighing pros and cons.
Definitely. There's and I think like no surprises, right? Like, all part of being like a good design manager is to make sure that your client is never surprised. So that, like, part of, you're such a conduit of like that information. And one thing that I found helpful with, I guess, making sure that the project is tracking well in terms of that quote that you might have originally sent, so that the client isn't surprised if you ask for more money, you might actually want to be putting together like a project health report. And so having a report that you might send out, depending on how long the project is going for, you might actually show them the project, the progress of how much budget is being used, like, you know, ticking off, showing them that they've had 1 or 2 rounds of changes. Having that kind of visibility can help you to more easily talk about money in a way where there's actually something to talk to. It's like, you know, these were the agreements, like this was the scope that we agreed, here we are checking them off, here's the project progress, is like a really great way that you can facilitate some conversations around money. Because I know that it's hard. It's hard to talk about money. Like, you send off an estimate and then it's like, cool, we do the work. And then, you know, you're having like your own conversations with your team about budget like all the time, but sometimes we don't actually bring the client into doing that. And for me, that's been like a really hard thing to learn, how to go out. And I still find it really hard to talk about project progress on the budget. It's a really, really hard thing to do.
I had a funny conversation actually today with a client. I had to, we've changed our hourly rate, and this particular client has a discount on our hourly rate. But because we changed our hourly rate, it changed their discount as well. And so I just figured I'm just going to ring them to tell it to them on the phone, because I feel like in an email it kind of comes across a bit strange. And he sort of just joked and said, well, I'll have to increase the price of my products then. And I didn't really know, but I thought, oh, well, I guess that's what it is. Everyone's got to, move forward in life. But I think when you're, as you say, when you don't put it off, when you regularly talk about money with your clients, then it just makes it a bit easier.
Definitely.
And it doesn't need to be, this weird thing. Like, they're not surprised that they're paying you for a service. It's not like they came to you for something and you're like, oh, cool, I'll do it. And then 2 months later, ask them for some money. I think we have this real false idea that it's like this awkward thing. And like, if one little thing goes bad, then they're going to like pull our money. And because we're the design manager, like the health of the studio, like relies on us. And that's not really the case. Nobody's surprised. They've come to you for a service. It's not, it shouldn't be a shock to them that you're asking.
I think that's a good segue into talking about invoicing. And that makes me think that it's happened to me before, where you wait too long until you invoice. And then it just becomes a point where it just feels really out of place to actually send an invoice. So I think talking about money early and not waiting too long to invoice. And it really saves, I think, a manager.
Like, put it in your contract. Like, it's definitely something that you can publish your invoicing milestones in your contract with the client. Like, say, these are the dates. These are the percentages of the overall price that will be invoiced at these milestones. You can do that. You can do that. Audrey, like, if, for a project like this type of thing, what sorts of milestones would you kind of have for invoicing?
Yeah, so most of, invoicing, I guess, is different from project to project and depending on the client. So most of the projects are invoiced 50-50, and we require payments before starting with new clients. I'm a little bit more flexible with regular clients that I know pay on time, because it might be that, we've got some availability in the studio and I don't want to wait until they actually pay for the invoice to schedule it in. When I know that they will be, I've got high confidence that they'll make the payments. But for larger projects like the one that we have in our example, I probably would invoice by milestone. So one of the challenges has been when you invoice 50-50 is that, say the client ends up, coronavirus happens, and then you started the project, you invoice 50%, but they just cannot finish the project. And then you're sort of being stuck a little bit where, like, you could do a progressive, an invoice based on the time that you've spent so far, but then it starts getting a little bit messy. Or say there's a delay. I find that sometimes we were having difficulties being able to invoice that like large chunk of the second end of the project. So for larger projects like this one, I probably do milestones. So, you invoice strategy, you invoice the brand identity, or, you can format it the way you like, concept for packaging, or, or you invoice just the packaging. So this is a nice way. And it's, in relation to adding project management within, deliverables rather than that as a line item, that helps because you can kind of invoice the whole package as you go through your project. An invoicing method that we've tested is to estimate how many months the project will take and equally divide the project amount over those months. So it just hasn't really worked out well for us, because as much as we'd like projects to follow a predicted course, often the schedule change for an unpredicted reason, and it's often sometimes that comes from the client. So we've had an example recently where we invoiced, I think, five invoices, and the project hadn't even had, we had only reached pretty much the first stage, and the client had already paid for the entire project, but we had barely started. But what it means then is that then you've got a lot of work to be done in those further months that you cannot invoice for. So it's sort of a bit difficult from a cash flow perspective. So milestone for me has worked really well, and I would probably apply this method for this project.
Yeah, I think you don't have to be scared of just going, like, you can only send an invoice once the work is done. Like, having some early conversations about money up front can really help exactly like your cash flow. You might have like a standard like agreement that you're just like, oh, well, the minimum that we always do is 20% up front and 80% on delivery. If the client is negotiating, or if they keep denying your request, you can like also say, okay, well, what invoicing milestones suit you? Like you can actually ask them those sorts of questions, because you might find out some additional things about, I don't know, I do a lot of work with government and not-for-profit, and so there's certain types of things around funding requirements that I'm not always privy to. So understanding all those types of things is really important to making sure that we can really help the person at their end in order to deliver the project too.
Yeah, and I think, I suppose, Andrea, with delivering goods, you must have such systems in place that you don't deliver them before you've been paid. And I feel like this is kind of you've probably have experienced this sort of a bad situation if you had delivered goods before you received the funds. Weirdly, in design, often we deliver the files but we haven't been paid yet. It's not so much a concern if you've got a good relationship with the clients, that they paid. But with new engagements, it's one of those things that we've had to chase payments for a long time, and it's time consuming. It's not pleasant. So I highly recommend stating before you start the project, and we invoice completion prior to delivering, final files. And then this way it just makes things much easier for you.
And I think even with us, timing is the way to do that. Oftentimes when we're doing a print job, if I know it's going to be done on Friday, I'll invoice them on Monday and be like, hey, it's going to be done on Friday. Because I know if I was the client, I'd be annoyed if I was like, oh, they're done. Oh, but you need to pay before you get them. And it's like on the day and already done. So I think, you're doing finished art, you know that in the next 2 weeks it's going to be done. You can invoice them now, and then it's not weird.
Totally. Well, it's kind of like, I think we're kind of pretty much ready to wrap up. We've got a few resources that we're going to share on the chat, but I thought it might be nice just for each of us just to round out, like, what's like one takeaway from each of us, like, that you reckon kind of helps demystify money when it comes to quoting. I've surprised this on you both, so maybe I can go first. I reckon my top tip is definitely use a worksheet and put down every little detail, because you will be surprised at all of the different things that you actually need to do to deliver the project actually add up. And a little bit of time at the beginning helps manage exactly all those things, like divvying up your different options for your quotes, understanding what the scope of the project is, and floating any unknowns that you might have at the beginning. So use a worksheet, or use your tool, your quoting tool, to step out every little thing that you want to do. Get detailed.
That's a really good tip.
I think mine would be around that around transparency and language, and not being, just being straightforward and clear, not being afraid to use the word expensive, kind of speak to the client in the language that they understand. I know you really want to do this thing, but it's really expensive, and I want you to be able to, get the most out of this. So let's go for this option instead. I think people get scared of using the word expensive, but I mean, it is what it is. And I think it shows and understand, like, it shows that you empathize and understand that this is especially if, you work with a lot of small businesses, like $20K, $30K, that's a lot of money. So being clear about what is included in what you're offering, and not being scared to use certain kinds of words, I think would be my big tip.
Yeah, that's really good. I have to say, Libby, it was so refreshing to hear that, it is, for me, hearing from your perspective that it's not in every case that you can do agile project management. Like, there are instances where, especially when you're working on a fixed project, that you got to use the waterfall method, and it's a normal process to use. So that was quite refreshing for me. But I think as a takeaway, to do good pricing, whether it is value-based pricing or any other kind of pricing, is just to ask a lot of questions before if you know that the project is worth it, if you know that you're going to be misaligned, I think it's just save yourself some time, save your client some time, send out a rate card. Then because you don't necessarily want to spend an hour of conversation and an hour of putting the quote together. But if you really want the job, is just to ask all those questions. And there's a number of those questions in Jonathan Stark's Hourly Billing is Nuts if you wanted to have a try at asking them. And we've got Catherine quickly saying, do you have any recommendations on chasing payments, assuming you have a good contact or contract in place? For me, is I will, if I've got a good relationship with the client, and then I see that after it's past its due date, I'll send a quick email, saying just checking on the payment, especially if we're in the process of delivering work and I want to deliver the work to them. If for some reason or another, the work has been done, there's an invoice that's sitting there, and perhaps it's a bit awkward, I just rely on the accounts, our bookkeeper, but we'll call them accounts, to send, to just chase payments. And if there is actually long and tedious chasing required because there's actually, it's problematic and they're not paying, I stay out of it, and it's our bookkeeper that is, taking, and then we have a conversation. So every week, my bookkeeper will send out a list of all the outstanding invoices, and I'll send an annotated version that says, chase this one, don't worry about this one, I've got it. So we've got a nice relationship that way, and I find that it's been quite smooth. And having an external person just makes it a little bit more serious that they have to make payment if there's a problem.
And you could put a finance, if you've got a good contract, like I don't think it's like unreasonable to put like an interest penalty on payments overdue by more than 30 days.
We've got one, and we rarely enforce it, but if it becomes a situation where it's just going to be a heads up, if we don't receive the payment before this date, there's going to be a 5% per day, charge, and generally that's enough to. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think also just mentioning your payment terms, when you begin the relationship with your client, unless they're really explicitly stated, our payment terms can be a bit buried in our T's and C's. So if I think there's some points that really need to be highlighted for our clients, just make sure to mention them early on.
What I do is going back to that kind of language and honesty thing, I'll just be honest. I'll be like, look, and I'll say it more professionally than this, but I'll say something along the lines of like, look, we're a small studio. We don't, we need this money. So kind of appeal to them on a human level. And obviously that doesn't work for everybody, but that's kind of like my first nice step. And, we've had to go to debt collectors before. And, that's kind of like, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and be like, hey, this invoice is still overdue. And then if I don't hear anything, I'll kind of appeal to them on that human level. And then I'll, threaten them with a debt collector. Again, depends on the situation.
Sounds ominous.
We've got to be confident about money. Don't be afraid of it. I think there's a lot of stigma about talking about it, especially if you're a sole trader, any of that type of scenarios where you are like the little guy, or you're working for yourself. It can be really hard because you're often the one having those conversations about money as well. But business is business. So on that note, I reckon there you have it. Like, our skincare brand approved our quote. We delivered the brand, the printing, and the website on time and on budget, and our client paid our invoice early.
The dream.
It's the dream.
I've just popped a poll in the channel. Something that we've been talking about doing is kind of doing a version of this event, hopefully in person, maybe in the year 2030. Kind of having these conversations, but more specific to people, kind of bringing your specific questions and specific scenarios that you've had to deal with or are dealing with. So if anybody would be interested in doing something like that in the future when it's legal, let us know, and we'll keep an eye out for that when that is possible. And I think that's it from us this evening, unless you guys wanted to add anything else.
All good. So I hope you're all going out like okay out there, barely managing like the rest of us. So hope you're all keeping safe. So hit us up, join us on, you can join at our website, wearebarelymanaging.com. There's a link through to join our Slack community, join in on the fun. We have a lot of fun barely managing with each other, really. So we're each other's support crew, and we like to talk shop about all the nerdy project management things that we do day to day. So thanks everyone for joining tonight.
Thanks very much. Take care. Have a nice beverage. Enjoy your dinner.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.